It is August 14th, 2025, and Indian Prime Minister Modi is set to travel to China for the first time in over 7 years. That's where he is expected to meet face to face with Chinese President Xi Jinping. As yet another reminder that countries within the multipolar world are figuring out that they really need to start working together because the US is continuing to work against them. All of this as we are also following the ongoing genocide targeting the Palestinian people in Gaza and in the West Bank. We're seeing the ways in which Israel is specifically targeting whether it be children, doctors, and especially journalists, as we have watched Israel murder nearly 270 journalists, a whole new record for the world in less than 2 years, all with the full backing and support of the United States. We got into all of the latest with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Vijay Prashad, an executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, editor of Leftward Books, and chief correspondent at Globetrotter. Vijay, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
It's a pleasure. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, it's great to have you back on the show. Now, I want to get your take on a few different things, but I want to start off in the Middle East because we know that for nearly 2 years now, Israel has refused to allow a single foreign journalist to enter the Gaza Strip. During that time, Israel has also murdered nearly 270 journalists and media workers inside Gaza, including multiple Al Jazeera journalists in a targeted strike on their tent last weekend. And never before in history have we seen such a targeted effort to silence the voices raising awareness about an ongoing genocide. So how do you see it, and what are your concerns about the fact that Israel continues with these massacres and the international community, they kind of just shrug, maybe they condemn it, and then they move on and no change actually happens?
Yeah, I mean it's horrifying. Okay, what's happening is genocide. I mean, I don't even know if we're going to come up with a term that exceeds that, because at some point this is not merely a genocide. It seems to be something worse than that. I can't fathom the level of violence being visited upon a people, starvation campaign, bombings, and then, as you say, an attempt to muzzle the ability of people to find out what's happening. Let's put a little bit of what's happening in Gaza into context. Since 1948, the Israelis have basically tried to erase Palestinians from the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea all the way out to Egypt. They've just tried to erase them. And there has been a systematic campaign to do that. In Gaza, it has been absolutely brutal. The entire space of Gaza has been bombed. 2 million people are living amidst rubble. The only journalists that are there are Palestinians who have been reporting from within. So they don't need permission to go in, they're already there. I've already lost 4 people that I know, that I have known personally, 4 Palestinian journalists who've been killed in the last couple of years. That's out of the number you said, 270. For me, that's 4 too many. 270. I can't even fathom what that's like, to have the faces of 270 journalists go before my eyes. Of course, this is now in the context of 50, 60, I don't know how many thousands of people dead, 70, 80, 100,000. The numbers have stopped stunning people. But that's Gaza. Absolute extermination of the population seems to be the mission. But at the same time, in the West Bank, the Israelis have been going in there and arresting people who are leaders in their communities. In other words, to do what the Israeli political scientist Baruch Kimmerling calls politicide, to kill the politics in the West Bank. And it's not been much recognized, but they've been bringing these prisoners into Megdot prison and others in northern Israel, stuffing them into solitary, feeding them almost nothing, not allowing them to clean their cells. There's a scabies outbreak in this prison, and about 70 odd prisoners have died. A 16-year-old just died, collapsed in the yard and died, showed that he had edema in his body from being beaten and so on. This is a form of actually extermination of all Palestinians from the entire area, not just in Gaza. And yes, this is happening in Gaza, no foreign journalists allowed. And what's happening in the West Bank is not being reported. The Palestinian Prisoners Society just this week released a report saying in July and August, so many prisoners have died in prison, etc., etc. Well, there's no reporting. Marwan Barghouti has had his ribs broken. Leader of Fatah has had his ribs broken in Magdod prison in the north. Ahmad Sadat has not been allowed to see people, leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. This is what Kimmerling calls politicide. This is what we're seeing. It's an outrage.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I'm glad that you bring up what's happening in the West Bank too, because it has just been horrific to watch Israel kind of slowly and methodically moving in, targeting the Palestinians there. And of course, every time you watch Netanyahu give a speech about Gaza, he says, oh, but Hamas, we have to go in and defeat Hamas. Well, clearly, if you watch what they're doing in Gaza, it has nothing to do with trying to defeat Hamas, everything to do with trying to wipe out as many Palestinians as they possibly can and to completely destroy the territory. But then you look at the West Bank and you go, okay, well, Hamas is not in charge here. So then why is Israel doing what they're doing? Exactly as you're noting there, they're not just going after the Palestinian people, they're going after anyone who could rise up and be a potential leader, to form a potential governing body, to present any kind of a challenge to Israel in any way. As we're watching that happen, what are your concerns for really the international response or lack thereof to this? Because what Israel's doing, it is absolutely inhumane, but it also has the full and total backing of the United States and a number of other Western countries.
I mean, look, let's engage this directly because it's very important what you just said. The most important thing is with the death of Yasser Arafat, the Palestinians lost a political leader. There has been no political leader. Whatever one thinks about Yasser Arafat in his later years, and I don't want to get into that debate and discussion. There is no question for those who remember him when he was alive, particularly in the 80s and 90s, early 90s, before Oslo, Yasser Arafat was the voice of the Palestinians. He spoke with a certain gravity and emphasis and so on. When Mr. Arafat died, was killed, as you see it, was killed, the only legitimate figure during the Second Intifada that emerged was Marwan Barghouti. Mr. Barghouti, was the main voice during the Second Intifada. The Israelis picked him up during the Second Intifada. He's been in prison for 23 years. They stuffed him into prison, knowing full well that he was emerging as the young leader of Fatah, the main faction in the Palestinian Liberation Organization. He would have been a very good challenge to the kind of bureaucracy of Mahmoud Abbas and so on. They've had Mr. Marwan Barghouti in prison 23 years. In fact, Ahmad Sadat, who I mentioned, the leader of the Popular Front, has been in prison for 1 month less than Marwan Barghouti. So also 23 years and about 3 months. Marwan Barghouti, 23 years and 4 months. 23 years he has been in prison because they know that people like Marwan Barghouti or Ahmad Sadat, Khalida Jarrar, who was brutally treated in prison before she was released. She aged terribly in prison. They didn't allow oxygen into her cell. She had to lie down on the ground and breathe from the crack in the door, from a little pipe that she found there. These people are being erased. The Palestinians are not being allowed to have a national leader emerge, and Hamas is simply not capable of producing a leader of all Palestinians. They have a certain sectoral view of things. Yahya Sinwar became more famous after his death than when he was alive. Mr. Sinwar was a sectoral leader of Hamas. They have never claimed to speak for all the Palestinians. They simply cannot because of their ideology and their politics. But Marwan Barghouti can lift up again the mantle of Arab nationalism, Palestinian nationalism, and so on, which Hamas as a Muslim Brotherhood organization has a challenge. And the Israelis have directly decapitated the leadership of Arab nationalism and Palestinian nationalism. And so you don't have a unifying figure. I mean, around this entire genocide, no Palestinian has been able to emerge as the leader, the leading voice, not just one, but two or three. But I mean, it's important in a national liberation struggle to have somebody who comes in and is able to speak with clarity about the situation. You've had outsiders speak for the Palestinians, but it's not been easy. Why? Not because Palestinians can't create a leader, but Israel has absolutely methodically prevented the rise of that leadership. And then they turn around and say, oh, Hamas. Well, if Marwan Barghouti had been out of prison, you wouldn't merely have had Hamas. You would have had an authentic leader of the PLO, much more beloved than Mr. Mahmoud Abbas, who's operated, in many respects as a kind of bureaucrat for the Oslo Accords, which these other leaders would not do. They are still people who believe in Palestinian emancipation, not just the Oslo Accords. So you don't have that. And because you don't have that, the Israelis have taken advantage of the situation they've created. And then they just say, look, it's Hamas who are taking care. But you're quite right. Where's the Hamas in Jenin? Why are you arresting these 20-year-old, 15-year-old, 18-year-old kids? You're going into these neighborhoods. I've written an article about the prisoners recently. At the end of the article, I talk about the fact that when the Israeli troops were in northern West Bank, there's video of Israeli soldiers kicking living Palestinians off the third floor of a building, just kicking them off the roof, falling down. We have no idea what happens to them. We have no idea because no journalists are there. I mean, after the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, who had gone for Al Jazeera to report in the northern part of the West Bank, and she was sniped by an Israeli soldier. It's very dangerous to follow the Israelis into the West Bank if you're not an embedded, journalist for Israeli propaganda machine. Very difficult. The video that I watched was taken by somebody from another rooftop, uploaded on social media and so on, circulated very little, not much. Circulated very little in the Arab sort of media landscape. But that's what I'm trying to say is that they just are not permitting journalists, but also leadership to emerge to speak for the Palestinian people.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I wish more people, especially in the US, were aware of that as they're watching this play out, aware of how much of it, especially in Western media, is constructed a certain way. I know that Netanyahu just brought in 45 US journalists to go on a little media tour of Israel. They apparently stepped foot into the Gaza Strip so that they could say that they were there all for Israel to show the world that this is not a genocide, right? Don't worry, we have everything under control. Yet at the same time, you have Netanyahu talking about, going in and occupying Gaza City, putting not only the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that live in central Gaza, putting their lives at risk, but also putting the lives at risk of these IDF soldiers that would be going in, and possibly even leading to the deaths of some of the remaining hostages. So how do you view Israel and the US and kind of the way that they're handling this genocide? Because it feels like every few weeks there's a new idea of, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And it's all aimed at just trying to wear the Palestinians down, trying to push them as far south as they can. But they don't seem to have a cohesive plan beyond just flat out extermination.
I mean, I don't know what to add to what you said because I tend to believe that what you said is true. Couple of things, though, reflections, really more than an answer to what you're saying. One is that it is absolutely the case that the Israelis are trying to manage the US media. I think they have realized that, in a sense, the media also cannot be entirely, taken for granted. That, you are seeing people very strange breaks from the consensus. Tucker Carlson breaking from the consensus, allowing people on his show to be very critical of what's happening in Gaza. You have Piers Morgan breaking from the consensus, spent years defending the genocide. Now he's saying, well, there's just too much going on there. Yeah, Donald Trump said in a press conference, yes, people are starving in Gaza. Even a factual statement coming from a U.S. president is stunning because we don't generally hear factual statements regarding the Palestinians. And then in the United States, to have a right wing congresswoman like Marjorie Taylor Greene come out there and say what she said, Matt Wirtz, I think his name is, or Gertz, who was considered at one time for a cabinet post on his show, going out there talking about how he was handled when he went to Israel, how he came back to his room early and an APAC fellow was in his room going through his stuff, and he was told that this is normal. Don't leave anything sensitive in your room. I mean, this kind of information is pretty stunning that it's coming out there in these kind of outlets, in the right wing and in some mainstream outlets. Now, the question is, this poses a challenge for the Israelis. So they are trying to manage the situation as best as they can. And it's difficult. Why? Firstly, the Jewish community in the United States is not a monolith, has not been a monolith, has been extremely divided on this issue for a long time. There has been a generational gap, but it's not just generational. It's also political, and it's moral and ethical. And some people make the argument that defend Israel at all costs because of the Holocaust, because Jews are persecuted people. That's one view. Others take the view, no, Jews have had a long history of making judgments about justice in the world and have been social rights fighters and so on in all struggles and contexts, and Israel should not be immunized from criticism. This debate inside the Jewish community has been there for a long time. Israel Hasbara or propaganda has tried to manage this, and now it seems it's very difficult for them to manage this. And so you are seeing a kind of complexity emerge, where even milquetoast governments like the Germans and the British and so on are saying, well, we might recognize the Palestinian state. These sort of comments shouldn't be taken lightly. It means that the popular pressure is getting to these governments. The cracks are happening, and the Israelis are going to have a hard time managing it. And they are going to escalate violence against the Palestinians to change the facts on the ground as quickly as they can in order to basically have a fait accompli when they say, okay, now we're going to cease fire. They're going to be very brutal in the next period. That's why the arrests in the West Bank are happening very, very, on an accelerated basis. And they've been killing about 100 people a day in Gaza, bombing about 100 people a day. 2,000 people have been killed, 2,000 plus. I don't know the numbers from today, standing queuing for food, So this escalation of violence is to change the facts on the ground. That's the one side of it. The other side of it is public opinion in Israel is going to start to also have a little crack. I mean, you're already seeing a lot of young kids going on the street saying, we don't want to serve in Gaza. There's a popular TV show was interrupted by a group of 5 activists who came, held hands, sat on the stage and started screaming, we can't be massacring people in Gaza and so on. Israeli television has completely not talked about the reality of Gaza. And so these little bursts of activity going to create some problems for the government. I mean, this government anyway is a minority government. I hope people recognize that. The government of Mr. Netanyahu, it's reliant on right-wing parties. There's an internal contradiction. These right-wing parties want to protect Orthodox Jews from serving in the military. This is annoying people as well. So, there are contradictions and strains, but while I say all this to you, and I'm saying this to you as bluntly as I can, I would also like to backtrack and say that one should not exaggerate too much, because the real problem here is not a problem of the Israeli genocide. It's not a problem of public opinion in the US or military supplies from Germany. The real problem is inside the camp of Zionism. The real problem is Zionism. And that is not going to be easily solved for one, the Jewish community in general, And secondly, for the Zionists in Israel, it's not going to be easy to solve the problem of Zionism, which is going to permanently create the conditions of apartheid if it is not rolled back.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. That's a really great point to keep in mind. And, I know so many people are watching us. You've got Netanyahu making comments about greater Israel, right? And it's like there's so many of these Zionist kind of fantasies that are becoming more mainstream. They're being talked about more so, not even just within the conspiracy circles. Now we're all kind of talking about it. And it is just incredibly troubling to watch. Now, while I have you here, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk more about the kind of multipolar world, some of the shifting tensions that we're seeing there, because we're all kind of keeping an eye on this upcoming summit between Trump and Putin that is set to happen on Friday in Alaska. And this comes after Trump created quite the firestorm, issuing ultimatums to Russia to end the war in Ukraine and even doubling tariffs on India over its continued purchase of Russian oil. And this is the interesting thing to me because after that, you had Prime Minister Modi come out and say, I'll go visit China for the first time in over 7 years, coming up at the end of this month, where he is set to meet with President Xi during a meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So, how do you view kind of the position that the multipolar world is in right now? I mean, if we're getting Russia, China, and India together, that's quite the accomplishment from Trump, whether he realizes it or not.
Well, the first thing is it's pretty incredible that Mr. Putin might come to Alaska. That's pretty incredible because don't forget, the United States pushed for the International Criminal Court to create a warrant for the arrest of Mr. Putin on the grounds of children being shifted from the war zone in Ukraine into Russia. There is a living ICC warrant for the arrest of Mr. Putin. Now, the United States has not ratified the Treaty of Rome that established the International Criminal Court. So, in a way, there's no legal obligation for the US to arrest Mr. Putin and hand him over to the ICC. But it is a risk for Mr. Putin to come to the US. I mean, I know they've cut a deal. He's not going to be arrested. Otherwise, this would never happen. They would meet in some third country. But I would say this is pretty stunning that the United States fought to get the ICC warrant, has the opportunity to arrest him. He comes into the US jurisdiction. And so he's coming willingly into the US. That's amazing. I think people should stop and pause and just think about that for a minute. So there's already a deal on the table. What's the deal about? That's what is interesting. You see, I mean, you can't take Trump's actions in moments. Like he's did this to India. He's plays at a big chessboard. He has some very smart people around him, and he's not a dummy himself. He's putting pressure here in order to create a deal there. It is in fact the art of the deal, in a sense. But I'm interested to see whether Trump can actually pull this off because you see, he's trying to get Mr. Putin to have some rollback from the war in Ukraine. But Mr. Putin is not going to budge. Certain conditions he's not going to budge on. One, the territory that is now part of Russia is not going back. That means the whole of the section of eastern Ukraine, the land bridge through Mariupol to Crimea. He's just not going to budge on that. There'll be other territorial concessions, but not that. I don't know how Mr. Zelensky is going to accept that. I mean, would be fascinating. Secondly, Mr. Putin has said he doesn't want NATO to expand and wants security guarantees. But that's easy because NATO is basically a lapdog of the United States. So US says, okay, do this. NATO will have to accept it. But the third one is interesting. Mr. Putin wants the government to be changed, replaced in Ukraine. That's interesting. I don't know how Mr. Trump can deliver that. I mean, it is true that Ukraine is due for elections. That I don't know what the mandate of this government is. It's a war government. They don't have elections and so on. But at some point, they're going to have elections. But Putin is insisting, I think, that the government change before the deal. That he may not want to sign a deal with Zelensky. And then the withdrawal of the Ukrainian supremacist bill, which doesn't allow people to speak, which in fact is not just against Russians, but Bulgarians and Poles and others who live in part of the territory of Ukraine. Anyway, I don't know how Trump is going to deliver on all that side of things. Secondly, I don't think the United States is going to succeed in creating daylight between China and Russia. I just don't see it. With the pressure campaign on Russia, a large section of Mr. Putin's own political base is fundamentally moved away from Eurocentrism towards a understanding that the future is in Asia and that Russia has to be also an Asian and a global South country, cannot be, become part of the G7 again, in the fantasy when it became the G8, cannot be a European country, even though most of Russia's population lives in historical Europe. They want to, I think, see themselves as Asian. And by the way, the largest growth cities taking place in Russia are all in the Asian part. So all of this demography and so on is going to play a role. And I don't think they're going to be able to split the no limits partnership that was signed in 2022. I just don't think so. There is a constituency of elites in Russia that want to settle with the Europeans, get their money back from European banks, make everything okay. There is a very strong constituency in Russia, but I don't think they are going to prevail. That's my own feeling, but I obviously cannot be sure. India is in an interesting position because India's government, the ruling party, the right wing party, is absolutely predisposed to be pro American. But over the years, the ruling party's foreign policy orientation has shifted to India first, let's say, something like India first. Mr. Modi's campaign slogan at one point was Make in India, that we should make more things in India. India should be our primary interest and so on. And during the period of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the oil from Russia was discounted. There's no way India would have not bought it because you'd have people starving at more expensive prices of oil. Yeah. And in fact, I think it's an excellent thing if China, India, and Russia create a settlement amongst each other. I mean, if Russia can help India and China settle the border dispute, even though it's a right-wing, horrible government in India, I'm very much pleased that Mr. Modi is going to see Xi Jinping, that perhaps the Russians will help broker some dial down of tension between India and China, because it is ridiculous that neighboring countries, have this problem that should be solved. There should be an increase of trade between India and China. I'm looking forward to something like that. Very much looking forward to it. So, to your broader question of the how the world is shifting, in our institute in January of 2025, we published a text called "The Churning of the Global Order." I still stand by that title of the text, "The Churning of the Global Order." There is no multipolarity. There is even no unipolarity. We are in the midst of major churning. I mean, the United States is trying desperately to control Europe, to bring Europe on side, to make sure that pulling the reins on Europe as much as possible. It's desperately contesting the Chinese entry into Latin America. It's contesting the Chinese economic, strength in the African continent and so on. I mean, there's a lot of churning going on. And in that sense, that's what makes life interesting for people like you and I, because we watch these things carefully and we keep trying to understand what's going on. Don't have a mechanical, sense of it. It's very much in motion. And, when things are in motion, life is interesting.
That it is. And I think that that's a good way to describe it. I'm with you, watching some of these updates going, okay, Putin and Trump are going to meet in person. Oh, Putin is going to Alaska. Okay, I know that we're all going to be watching very closely what happens coming up on Friday. It'll certainly be interesting to see. I know that there is a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down and to give us some insight on all of the latest here. Vijay Prashad, Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, editor of Leftward Books, and Chief Correspondent at Globetrotter. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. Thanks a lot.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanction. You can also check out Sanction over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/RachelBlevins. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.